Live NFL trivia every Tuesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge and have a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. When you think of teams missing their pick at the NFL draft, there's probably one instance that comes to mind. Your mind probably immediately went to the 2003 NFL draft, where the Minnesota Vikings had the 7th pick and let not one, but two teams pass them by, as the Jacksonville Jaguars and Carolina Panthers both leapfrogged them in the pecking order. As embarrassing as that moment was, at the end of the day, even though the Vikings lost the battle, they won the war. They wound up with Kevin Williams, a 6-time Pro Bowl defensive tackle, an all-decade team member, and a 5-time first-team All-Pro who played over a decade in Minnesota. Byron Leftwich wasn't good for the Jaguars, and Jordan Gross was a really good player for the Panthers, but none of them had the career that Williams did. What you might not know is that something very similar also happened in the 1980s. At the 1988 NFL Draft, the Houston Oilers not only let time expire on the clock, and not only allowed a division rival to leapfrog them, but they allowed that division rival to pick a player that they were likely going to pick. And yet, it all worked out for the Oilers in the end, as even though they lost out on their top choice because of the gaffe, they got a much better player. This is the story behind the Oilers' infamous draft blunder. Before I talk about the blunder, we need some context as to how the Oilers were looking heading into the 1988 NFL Draft, because this will help us to understand why they were torn between two players and couldn't decide. During the 1987 season, the Houston Oilers went 9-6. It was a shockingly good campaign that no one really saw coming. For the first time since 1980, which was Bum Phillips' last year in town, they had a winning record. After 5 straight seasons being either at the bottom of the division or the bottom of the conference, they were finally playing good football under Jerry Glanville. Warren Moon, after 3 straight seasons to start his career off with more picks than touchdowns, had what was easily the best year of his career at the time, finishing 7th in the league in passing yards and touchdowns. The offense went from the bottom quarter of the league to the top 10, and they were playing postseason football. In the wildcard round, they defeated the Seattle Seahawks in pretty controversial fashion, winning 23-20 in overtime. They followed that up with a blowout loss to the hands of the Denver Broncos, partly because of one of the most infamous play calls in the history of the sport. You can learn more about that play by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Entering the 1988 NFL Draft, the Oilers were looking to improve upon a shocking and surprising 1987 campaign. And there were 2 areas in particular that seemed to need the most help. One of them was running back. Houston only scored 10 rushing touchdowns across the 12 non-strike games. Mike Rozier was obviously really good. The former first-round pick in the 1984 NFL Supplemental Draft from the USFL had a career-best season in yards, receptions, receiving yards, and yards per carry, and was named to the first Pro Bowl of his career. There was just nobody behind him. Excluding Andrew Jackson, who was a scab player, the leading rusher on the Oilers behind Rozier was Alan Pinkett, who had just 149 yards. You think of the heyday of the Oilers, and it was a 2-headed monster with Earl Campbell and Rob Carpenter. You think of the best team in the league at the time, and it was the 49ers with Roger Craig and Wendell Tyler. And the postseason really showcased these problems running the ball. In the divisional round against Denver, they picked up just 73 yards on 26 carries, averaging a mere 2.8 yards per attempt. Nobody on the Oilers had more than 25 rushing yards that day. Even in the wildcard win against the Seahawks, they ran the ball 50 times and only averaged 3.5 yards a carry. Getting another running back to complement Rozier, especially since you already had a promising young fullback and first-round pick Alonzo Highsmith, and since you had a stacked offensive line with eventual Hall of Famers Bruce Matthews and Mike Munchak, could be big. However, there was another position that might have been of a higher need, and they were about to completely miss their chance to improve that. Maybe more important than their desire to improve at running back was their desire to improve their linebacking unit. Houston's pass rush was pretty weak in 1987. They only sacked the quarterback 35 times, which ranked 19th in the league out of 28 teams. However, when you break that number down, it gets worse. 5 of those sacks came in Week 4 against the Broncos. 4 of those sacks came in Week 5 against the Browns. Both of those games were scab games. If you eliminate the scab games, the Oilers were only averaging 2 sacks a game. No one on the team besides defensive end Ray Childress had more than 4 sacks. Their pass rush needed a significant improvement if they were going to take the next step. With that, the Oilers narrowed down their selection to 2 players. One was Michigan State running back Lorenzo White. He was coming off of a fantastic season with the Spartans where he ran for 1,572 yards and 16 touchdowns, and finished 4th in the Heisman voting. He led the Big Ten in rushing touchdowns and was the Big Ten Player of the Year as well. Combined with his 1985 campaign, where he led the NCAA with over 2,000 rushing yards, was Big Ten Player of the Year, and was fourth in the Heisman yet again, and he seemed to be the real deal. The other was Florida linebacker Clifford Charlton, who over his final 2 seasons with the Gators had 18 sacks and 40 tackles for a loss. Both players seemed like solid picks, and both would fill a big and pressing need on the team. So when the 21st pick rolled around, the Oilers were on the clock. There was heated discussion and debate about which one of these guys to take. Back then, teams had 15 minutes to make their pick in the first round. 5 minutes gone, no decision. 10 minutes gone, still no decision. 13 minutes gone, and still no decision. By this point, the Cleveland Browns at pick number 22 were noticing what was happening. They really wanted Charlton. In 1987, the Browns drafted linebacker Mike Junkin out of Duke and played him on the outside. It didn't work out too well as he didn't play well and missed time with a contract holdout and a fractured wrist. By drafting Charlton, they could move Junkin inside to his natural position. The Browns filled out a draft card with Charlton's name on it and went up to the podium just in case, so that if Houston didn't hand their card in time, the Browns could immediately capitalize on it. 14 minutes gone, and still no pick. Browns representative Charlie Cusick was ready to hand in that card once that clock hit triple zeros to leapfrog the division rivals. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. The Oilers couldn't decide on White and Charlton, so the Browns made the decision for them. The Browns leapfrogged the Oilers and took Charlton, leaving the Oilers to take White. Somehow, this might have been the best thing to happen to Houston. Browns owner Art Modell spoke to the press after, stunned at what just happened. He said that he'd never seen a first-round pass before, and that while it's not too unusual to see it in the 5-minute rounds later in the draft, where guys have a 50-50 shot at even making the roster, to have it happen in the first round was shocking. When someone asked Modell what he'd do if his team was late making a first-round pick, he joked and said, "You'd be amazed how you say payroll that way." Here's the crazy part though. Much like the Vikings in 2003 and the Ravens in 2011, the passage actually benefited the negligent team. Lorenzo White had a pretty solid NFL career. He spent 7 seasons in Houston and in 1992 made it to the Pro Bowl after finishing 5th in the league with 1,226 rushing yards. And he might have been the catalyst for the Oilers making the postseason that year. The Oilers were 6-5 and sliding heading into their Thanksgiving matchup against the Lions. Trailing 21-17 with just over a minute left in the game, White scored this 8-yard touchdown to give the Oilers the win. Houston won 4 of their final 5 games and made the playoffs that season because of it. As for Clifford Charlton with the Browns, not so much. He's one of the biggest first-round busts in franchise history. Charlton played just 2 seasons in the dog pound before tearing his ACL and MCL. In those 2 seasons, he made just 1 start and recorded just 1 sack. What you saw was literally the only sack of his entire career. The Browns beat the Oilers to the draft podium, but it wasn't worth it at all for the franchise. I guess in a weird way, the foolproof strategy to making sure you get a good player in the draft is to let time expire. The Ravens got Jimmy Smith out of it over Jonathan Baldwin, and he's been there for a decade. The Vikings got Kevin Williams out of it, and he was dominant for a decade. And the Oilers, instead of getting a guy who would only be in the league for 2 seasons, got a Pro Bowl running back. Not bad for such a critical draft mistake. Be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JRGator9 and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.